Before the pandemic, Latin America was already on life support. Populist elections happened in many of the countries. Then there was the further collapse of Venezuela and the subsequent refugee crisis that followed. Later on, there was the removal of Morales in Bolivia, and these were just a few events that have defined the last decade. It seems like this pandemic may bring even more upheaval and chaos to a region that doesn't need any more. Today, we're going to try to catch up on all of this on the Tonic Accord podcast. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I'm Alex Kapitko, joined by my friend and colleague, Drew Nepley. What's up, man?
Hey, Alex, how you doing?
How was your 4th of July? Do anything crazy?
No. This time it was way more low-key, small amount of people being safe and responsible, and that's about it. Kept it pretty low-key, and it was nice.
Good. Yeah, me as well. Just a little barbecue and brews, can't go wrong with that. But today I kind of wanted to talk about Latin America kind of in general because, we've covered China, we've covered Europe, we've definitely talked about the United States. And I feel like in the media in general, in most podcasts, I haven't really heard a lot of people talking about not only the pandemic, but just kind of the political situation in Latin America right now. Yeah. I mean, just today we saw that Jair Bolsanaro tested positive for coronavirus, and Brazil's number 2 in the world for the amount of cases and deaths. So obviously things are getting pretty serious, and other countries as well. So what are your thoughts on kind of this whole situation?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the big headline is Bolsonaro is now tested positive for COVID. This is a guy that pretty obviously downplayed it. Didn't wear a mask often in the early stages of the pandemic, even after kind of it was socially normed to do so. And then he made a statement that says, even if I do get it, I was an athlete when I was younger, so it won't affect me much. We'll see how true that is. Of course, no one wants him to be very sick, right? I do hope he recovers, but it's just a testament to, he wasn't exactly taking it seriously. Now he might start taking it more seriously. We saw this happen with why am I blanking on his name? The Prime Minister in the UK.
Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson, of course. So yeah, I mean, he was kind of, downplaying the virus until he got it, and then was put in intensive care. Then he came back out, thanking the NHS and all that. I don't know if we'll have that same thing with Bolsonaro, but if anything, it just shows how serious this is. Officials from the WHO have gone to say, look, this is evidence that it affects everybody, the prince or the pauper. And, this is an example of that. I do hope that Brazil starts to take it more seriously. The governors of the various states in Brazil have been more gung-ho about trying to combat the virus. And what's even crazy is some of the street gangs in these favelas have actually been the ones to enact lockdowns and people wearing masks because no one else would. So I found that really interesting how, when the top leadership does fail, when people are left to their own devices, they'll use their own devices. So I just thought that was a really interesting thing to see, is some of these street gangs even getting involved in the combating the pandemic.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, and it does seem like Brazil, I mean, pretty similar to the United States in a lot of ways, has just had an epic fail involving this virus, And I mean, Forbes reports that 50% of daily cases around the world are all in Latin America. And I think U.S. media has been so focused inward, between the pandemic and the protests, that we haven't really mentioned a lot of this. But it is pretty insane. And kind of my takeaway from this in some ways is that it seems that in the Americas, North, Central, and South, populism seems to be a disease which is worse than the disease we're fighting in dealing with this pandemic. And I'm not saying right-wing populism or left-wing populism, but both sides. Populist governments just kind of seem to have failed the pandemic more than others. Because, I mean, we've talked about Bolsonaro, and that situation seems to be unfolding quite horribly. You have the same issues in the U.S. where you have the federal government is kind of at odds with governors and cities, like you said. And it seems to be that you kind of just have this populist mantra that seems so adverse to facts and the right response. And the same is even in Mexico. I mean, Mexico is the region's second most populous country, and it's recorded over 250,000 cases and 30,000 deaths. And Peru and Chile have also reported nearly 300,000 cases And so we're kind of seeing a trend in Latin America is that it's interesting because a lot of them locked down early, but a lot of them still seem to be really failing to deal with this, probably due to a mix of issues such as poverty, inequality, government division, and it's just kind of interesting to see that really there's not many countries doing well.
Yeah, in Latin America, yeah. I mean, I think, I think maybe the reason populism and something like the pandemic blend so horribly is because populism is really based off of, like, a lot of populism, in my view, is really dependent on rhetoric and appearances. Simplifying things down to very easy slogans, and so complex science kind of is at odds with that, and especially when you are like a populist leader like Bolsonaro, or Trump, who's very, very like based on their appearances as a strong man and their popularity. But then you have to give bad news, right? Bolsonaro didn't want to have to give bad news and realistic bad news to the people. And I think that, that's at odds with populism. Populism is rising the people up and getting them excited. Populism is not being like, hey guys, sorry, it's gonna kind of suck for a while, and we need to suck it up. It doesn't. Maybe the nature of populist politics and propaganda is at odds with a realist scientific worldview.
That's a really good point. And I think you're probably right, just because I feel like, at least from my studying of populism, it's kind of, the populist movement versus the system. And so now you have a pandemic where you almost need the system and the experts that work for the system to kind of dictate how you go forward.
Right.
And it's really difficult, when the whole mantra is anti-establishment, anti-science, anti-bad news, like you said. I think that's a really astute point. And it's interesting to me because also AMLO, the Mexican president, who is a left-wing populist,
right,
he has also downplayed the virus for probably similar reasons, but for different political sightings for it, right?
You're right.
And it is fascinating because, I think we've talked about this, individually outside of the podcast a lot as well, is that Latin America seems to always be very up in the air with the political tides, right? It's very easy to sway back and forth. And I'm quite concerned that this whole pandemic is going to be just a nail in the coffin to already changing times. You've had in Bolivia, right? I mentioned in the opening that Evo Morales, when he was forced to step down, they had the interim government come in, right? And the leader of this, Agnes, she has basically taken advantage of this. Bolivia is one of the earliest countries to lock down in Latin America. And since then, basically, she has used this as a way to maintain power, limiting protests, limiting counter government protests. And now they have 33,000 confirmed cases and over 1,000 deaths. And there's reports of bodies being left in the streets, morgues being filled, and in the northern tropical region, there's reports of no medical supplies, no ventilators, no oxygen. People are literally just dying on the streets. And the government is taking advantage of this deeply polarized situation to kind of weaken public willingness to obey the lockdowns. And now they've canceled local elections, they've canceled the national elections, and now it seems like this right-wing Christian party, which is run by Agnes, is going to try to maintain power, though a lot of the population still supports Evo Morales. So, could be bad.
Yeah, look, obviously there, I definitely believe that political parties of all aisles will use something like this, use peril to their advantage. That's just kind of, we've seen it through history. It'd just be interesting to see like the longer term effects, right? We both read the article, The Lessons of the 1930s and 1980s for Latin America, from The Economist, and that talked about how, the economic recovery is going to be a lot longer than the lifespan of this virus, and people will forget that their economic hardships are tied to the virus, right? When we're in 2023 and some of these countries are still lagging, back to get to where they were last year, people might not be as, understanding of how that it was the pandemic's fault, and they might blame their leaders. Now, some of these leaders are to blame, right? I think a lot of it is, had some of these leaders locked down earlier, there actually would have been some, weathering of the economic storm. We're finding out now that, even places like Goldman Sachs, the United States, have said, had we reacted earlier, we actually could have stopped some of the GDP loss. So I think I think longer term, in the next few years, it's going to be this economic downturn that will shift political movements around. Whether the status quo is a centrist getting removed by a populist, or vice versa, right? Like a Bolsanaro getting ousted because of his complete failure of a response.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're correct that this is only kind of the beginning of potentially another realignment in Latin America. I mean, we've kind of seen that time and time again. You have a right-wing, usually military militia or some sort of contra-government group, paramilitary group that comes up, and then that's followed by kind of a leftist Marxist revolution, right? And I would imagine that the same thing is going to happen again, because that same Economist article, talked about how the economic crisis in the 1930s led to a large amount of political upheaval, and then also again in the 1980s, and this is probably going to put down just these countries on that same road. And it is kind of concerning because a lot of these countries don't have the infrastructure and the safety nets to deal with this, and like you said, it will be easy to blame politicians, either if they're in the fault or not. And I remember that article also said that one of the biggest threats is that the army returns as a political actor, because obviously a lot of military and intelligence have been given a bigger role during this pandemic, right? And we're already seeing, in Brazil and Venezuela and even in Mexico and Bolivia, the military is getting a stronger role. And to me, just looking at the history of Latin America, whenever the military starts to get a bigger role in government, it's usually not a good ending. I'm thinking of Chile specifically, or Brazil in the 1970s and 80s. It usually doesn't end good.
No.
And hopefully they're not going backwards, because in some ways we have seen a lot of social progress in Latin America over the last decade or two.
Yeah. I wonder if maybe the division between the countries in Latin America that are trying to progress into becoming more like free global democracies, as opposed to those that are kind of doubling down on the pink tide, like Venezuela. I wonder if the difference will be greater, right? The difference between Argentina and Venezuela, the gap will get wider after this pandemic, because of these shifting sands as a result of the virus. I mean, Venezuela, already incredibly impoverished and had led to what you could consider a mass exodus of 5 million people over the last few years into neighboring countries like Colombia. Now, on top of this, there's reports that their hospitals don't even have running water at times, are very, very ill prepared for this pandemic. What little information we have about how Venezuela's treating this pandemic is really poor. And almost non-existent. And so I think, with the Maduro's failed leadership of their nation and his cracking down on political parties, I think they're almost doubling down as being the kind of garbage dictatorship of the land. And, I wonder if other countries will just start to really pass them by, right? And kind of, join the world stage while Venezuela's left in the dust by its own doing. I wonder if this inequality among developed and lesser developed nations will grow further.
It probably will. I would just assume, and I mean the problem though, I feel like in Latin America specifically, is that not every country is a Venezuela by any means, but almost every country minus Uruguay, which I want to get into in a little bit, has pretty much effed this up.
Right.
And so. I think that same Economist article, I have the number here. The IMF expects the economy to contradict by 9.4% this year, with only a moderate recovery next year. And so I think obviously that would be horrific for Venezuela, because I think their inflation's at about 750% right now, which I can't even fathom. But then you also have other countries that are not far behind them, like El Salvador. They also have a strong man in. And Bolivia is, I think, the poorest country in South America. I mean, they were. I would say maybe not with Venezuela now, but still, I think you're right. You're probably going to see countries like Argentina and Chile, and I think the verdict's still out on Brazil. But I think you will see them be able to get out of this. And I know there's this kind of pan-Hispanic movement, and I'm curious if that would be stalled. Kind of this Bolivarian movement would be stalled if you have just large amounts of resentment coming out of this.
I think so.
Yeah, and I don't see it being good. I mean, because the Americas, I think in general the brainchild was supposed to be that eventually we were kind of hoping to have a trading bloc similar to the European Union, but you have Canada and the United States and Mexico that aren't getting along at all, and now you have fracturing in Central and South America as well that I just don't see how good would come out of that, and on Venezuela, what you're talking about too. I think a lot of the West is somewhat regretful of when they acknowledged Juan Guaido as the leader of Venezuela, because clearly he's not the leader of Venezuela, and I think that acknowledgement has just allowed Maduro to really consolidate power. Because just today, Maduro's ordered the takeover of Guaido's party,
Right.
and he's appointed the leader of the party, Jose Gregorio Noriega, who is a scandal-ridden friend of Maduro. And so we're just seeing more erosion of democracy. I mean, if there's any democracy left. And the sad part is I think people are going to get poorer. And the funny, well, not funny, but just ironic part in Venezuela is that they're trying to create this socialist, the socialist haven. And according to the Global Health Security Index of 195 countries, Venezuela's healthcare is ranked 146th.
Yeah.
And they can't even, like you said, have water in hospitals. So clearly there's disparity, and sorry, rant's done. It's kind of horrifying.
No, I mean, let's dive into that a little bit, because I'm certainly no expert on the intricacies of the Venezuelan limit of powers. But from what I understood by looking at how he is taking over these parties, is basically he takes those parties to court under the guise that they're trying to run scam elections and they're doing something illegal. The court has been stacked by Maduro himself. So then his already stacked court then decides, yes, this opposing party is engaging in illegal activity and should be dismantled, or the leader needs to change, and then he appoints a leader that's loyal to him. So for those that are unaware of, like, how can you just get rid of enemy parties? It's through this judiciary system that he already has control over. So, again, I think one, in general, that's just a good lesson that, institutions alone are not immediately, a panacea for corruption, right? You can have an institution that's supposed to be justice and judiciary, but it doesn't mean you can't, obviously be used for something like fascism or dictatorships. So Venezuela is a good example. And then two is that, how is Juan Guaido now being ousted from his own party? And that's how. It's through this court system that Maduro is using, and then it's stacking his own members that are loyal to him. Yeah, I mean, this guy is circling the drain, I think, as far as or the country itself. Venezuela is circling the drain.
Yeah.
And Maduro is just obtaining more and more power. But again, I think that's a double-edged sword, because, oil is the lowest it's been in years. On top of the pandemic and on top of Venezuela's already well-known problems we've talked about before, this country is not going to get better anytime soon. And I just wonder how long it will be before, people are like, everyone either leaves the country or is ready for a full-scale revolution, because this Maduro guy is running it into the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely. And I mean, to be the pessimist here, I don't really know how this turns out, mainly because let's just imagine this pandemic gets worse in Latin America, which I think it's going to.
Yes.
Neighboring countries are probably going to completely seal off any interstate travel. So people are not going to be able to leave Venezuela, and if they do, there could be risk of violence, or being locked into a prison or holding facility where the risk of getting coronavirus could be even higher. And then from the international community, everyone's already struggling just to put stimulus packages together to save themselves. So there's probably going to be no international effort right now to help Venezuela. And then third, I think you're seeing, especially if Guaido is being ousted from his own party, and you have people that are probably desperate, I would imagine even a revolution would be half-assed and probably pathetic at this point, just because of the dire situation inside of the country with resources.
Right.
That I just see a kind of a smoldering dumpster fire. And it's really unfortunate, because this was a country that really has been historically afloat and has a rich history, has done well for themselves economically through oil, and they've kind of just thrown all the money into the dumpster fire. And now like you said, they're circling the drain, but I just don't know how they get out of this. And it's kind of alarming because, I mean, this is a country that you would think in some ways would be equipped to deal with a pandemic, mainly because Maduro has absolute control, right? And still they couldn't do it because this socialist haven, as I keep saying, can't even provide the resources that they were hoping to do. But I guess it is hard when you don't have any money coming in and your economy is just plummeting.
Yeah, I mean,
So
the Dutch disease with oil. I mean, there's so many factors. His whole government is made up of his friends and not experts to begin with, right? So, ill-equipped government. Maduro himself has downplayed the virus, and he's just straight up lied about it. Like back in March, he said he gave out 1 million tests when Europe had only done like 1,000 at that point. And so he's like, "Oh, we've tested 1 million tests out here. We're way in control." It's like, dude, there's no way. There's no way that you're have a 10,000 times more testing capability than Europe. Like, I just don't buy it at all. That's just not. That just can't be true. So, this guy is obviously the same thing. We've been saying he's trying to save face. He's trying to be all the strong man, but in reality, it's hurting his people. And we talked about how this was the country that was trying to do that trading bloc, trying to create an alternative to the what they viewed as the evil Western capitalist system, and they failed. And the ALBA agreement has only been losing members. Less and less people use the sucre, which is the currency they tried to set up for the trading bloc. Almost no one uses the sucre. And so, it was a complete failure. And this is kind of just maybe the nail in the coffin for Venezuela. Unfortunately, millions of people that are innocent of these things are going to get affected by it. But it's not all bad news in Latin America, right? I think you want to talk about a little bit about Uruguay and how they're actually doing pretty well comparatively.
right, and I just want to close one thought on Venezuela before we go to that, is that I think, we were talking about how populism inside of a country kind of tries to put a us versus them narrative, to kind of put, the struggling people versus the establishment or whatever it is. And I think Venezuela, especially under Chavez and then Maduro, have crafted somewhat of an international populism.
Yeah, definitely.
Where it's it's kind of looking at the West and the United States specifically as kind of this evil establishment. And again, for the same reason why I think domestic populism's failed, I think it's the same reason why this is inevitably failed as well. But that we could do a whole other episode on that probably.
Sure.
But on Uruguay, it is interesting because they are a country that is flourishing. Well, okay, not flourishing, because I don't know if anyone in the world's flourishing, but the nation hasn't had more than 100 active cases at any point for almost a month. And in all, it's reported just 932 confirmed cases since the pandemic began. And I think around 25 deaths. And next door, Argentina has had over 62,000 cases. So that's 62,000 cases to 932 cases. And it's kind of interesting as well because Uruguay is going to begin opening up their classrooms, and even in the capital of Montevideo. And I think this is kind of what you were talking about several months ago now, was that Uruguay was kind of a similar model to what happened with Taiwan and South Korea, is that they were quick to act and quick to issue a voluntary lockdown. And that seems to be a growing trend, right? But also Uruguay is ranked number 2 on the continent for social spending at over 17% of their GDP. And they seem to have a lower poverty rate at 8.8% last year. So they're a small country with great social spending, and they lock down quick.
Right. It's an example to me of an effective government that has social spending compared to Venezuela, which is an ineffective government with high social spending.
Right.
Uruguay is not, their economy is not based solely off oil, and as well as they're a more free established democracy instead of a kind of a dictatorship. But they have a high social spending. They're a percentage of their GDP is in between Chile and Brazil. They are a smaller country, right? And so and from what I understand, not that dense of a population. So that's obviously going to play a part. But even comparatively with other nations, they're doing really well. And I do think it's the rapidness of their response, and people listening, right? People paying attention, and people enforcing their own rules themselves, I think has a big part to play. But yeah, I mean, it definitely is. I mean, it's a stark contrast when you look at some of these countries, and Uruguay is doing okay.
Right. Right, exactly, and I mean, I've just from the little I know of Uruguay is that it's kind of been the beacon on the hill in Latin America for progress, especially social progress, and it kind of seems to be kind of a laboratory for change. Because I think it's a small country that's not densely populated. I think it has about 3 million people total. So it's definitely not it's a safe small country that I think has experimented with progress for a long time. Like it's one of the first countries in Latin America to legalize gay marriage. They've had free education for a long time. And so I think, like you said, this was a country that did smart infrastructure spending and was prepared for this.
Right.
Now, unfortunately, I just don't know how it would be possible in a country like Brazil, where you have a very federal system, very similar to the United States. It's giant. You have a populist leader, but you also have good mayors and good governors, but they still can't do enough when there's no federal message, right? So while I think Uruguay is a great, positive story, a happy news line, it's still, I don't know if the same would even be possible in a country as big as Brazil or Mexico.
I do. I think part of it is Uruguay from what I'm reading and understanding, is they had a pretty well established and robust healthcare system that was that they have good doctors and good facilities. Where I don't think you could say the same for maybe parts of rural Brazil. You definitely can't say the same for Venezuela. We all know that they don't even have running water in some of their hospitals. And then maybe Mexico as well, like a large nation like Mexico. I don't think everyone has access to robust and good healthcare like you would in Uruguay. So I think that's an important factor as well. Is just Uruguay was just structurally with their institutions of their healthcare more prepared.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And that seems to be the trend around the world. Countries with good public health care that acted quickly and have good transparency between the government and their citizens. That seems to kind of be the bingo of how you do well during the pandemic.
Right.
I also have to ask you, this is not coronavirus related, but I believe tomorrow's July 8th, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Trump is meeting with AMLO, who's Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the president of Mexico. And a lot of people think this is a very important meeting. It's going to be on the USMCA, or the United States Mexico Canada Agreement. But Justin Trudeau has said he will not be attending. So what do you think of that? Is that good news for this for this agreement?
Well, look, I generally think that anytime leaders talk, it's better than not talking at all. I understand why Justin Trudeau doesn't want to go, given he probably doesn't want to be the next world leader to get coronavirus. I understand that. It might be a little bit political. Let's be real. It's probably a little bit political. But I think, the fact that parts of the Mexican border have been closing to United States citizens leaving America, going to Mexico, and with how everyone is super on edge during this pandemic, I do hope it's a good thing. I hope they're. Do you know exactly what they're going to discuss? Because I imagine they're going to discuss the pandemic, among other things.
Yeah. From what I got from the Hill, well, like as the Hill says it, AMLO and Trump are basically want to first off talk about what you're talking about with the border, because the state of Sonora, I believe it is, which is on the California and Arizona border, has shut off to tourists because people were going down during the 4th of July. Right. And I don't think you want people from Arizona, which is one of the global epicenters, not even the United States epicenters. And so that is happening. And I think it is a publicity stunt to a certain extent, because both are dropping in polls. Both are criticized for their handling of COVID-19, and there are fears about spread over the border. So it does seem like this is probably more of a discussion between the two over what's happening on the ground right now. But there are also talks about continuing the ratifications of this USMCA treaty. But to me, it is interesting to see that Justin Trudeau is not coming, because Justin Trudeau has had a very interesting couple months. He was in front of the UN's, I believe it was the UN Security Council, to get one of the official permanent seats, and Canada was turned down. And clearly, there's been criticism between him and Trump. So I think that Trudeau is probably quite fearful of what's happening with the virus, but also his international politics are not doing great right now. He's loved inside of Canada, but a lot of the rest of the world, his popularity is waning. So I think there's a lot of politics at play here, and I think right now Trump and AMLO kind of need a good camera session right now during all this chaos, because let's be honest, both countries, we're sharing the border, and both of us are kind of going down together while Canada seems to be doing better.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's why Justin Trudeau decided not to go. He doesn't want to be seen. He doesn't want to be seen talking without a mask on or whatever with the two guys that are kind of arguably not doing so hot with the pandemic while he is. So he figures, I'll just stay out of it. I think talking is always good. We do need to kind of figure out this border situation, especially when it goes to trade, right? Like, do you still let trucks go across? We still need to hash some things out. So I think that's good. But I certainly hope they take precautions, right? I still rarely see Trump with a mask anywhere, and I don't think that's a good idea. I think image is important, and to see leaders taking precautions does encourage people to take precautions, and vice versa, right? Leaders not taking precautions encourages people that maybe are on the fence to say, "Oh, well, I don't have to. I don't see the president doing it." So I know that's a small thing, but I do hope that they wear masks at their little press conference or whatever, because people are watching and people are taking notice.
Yeah, definitely. And the last thing I'll say is I was telling our Uber driver this on the 4th of July, and it's something that's kind of really hit me hard, I guess, being in Europe and then coming back here, is I think the US, Mexico, and Brazil kind of have a similar problem where I'm very supportive of our American system. I like our federal system for a lot of reasons. I think our country's so big that we need states, provinces, counties, etc. But I think during a global pandemic, sometimes the fragmented nature of our whole system almost doesn't help us. You almost need a central authority that can kind of enforce something. And I think Trump is easy to blame, but I would also say that in general, our system is not meant to really have something like this happen. Like, the U.S. is not meant to deal with lockdowns. And I think the same you could say would be with Brazil and Mexico. And so we're seeing that is that because we're so fragmented and because of all the just division, it's really hard to actually get solutions quickly.
I mean, that may be true, right? I mean, that's definitely true. And even just kind of the cultural aspect of American individualism, for better or worse. Yeah. That I think that plays a part. There's a ton of things that play a role, but let's not forget that Trump himself deferred responsibility to the governors verbally, saying, basically saying it's the responsibility of the governors. It's not my job, and I think we're seeing the results of some of that. And some governors did some good things, some governors did some bad things, and we're seeing it play out. Definitely. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. It's kind of just a weak milquetoast way to do it. If the governors mess up, Trump can say he was right, and if they do well, he can say, well, it wasn't my responsibility. So right. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you have any more thoughts, but Latin America sounds interesting right now, and it sounds cliche, but I do have my thoughts with them. I hope that there is some form of positive revolution or positive pushback against some of these governments, but. As always, you guys can check us out on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, YouTube, and all those third-party sites. Please let us know what you think. Summer's coming around. Are there any topics that we're kind of missing through all this, pandemic and global affairs stuff? Please let us know. And as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in.